In the quiet of an upscale neighborhood, behind the imposing walls of a meticulously kept home, a tragedy had quietly unfolded. The death of Thomas Jameson seemed at first like a terrible accident, a natural cause that couldn't have been avoided. But in truth, his demise had been anything but natural. It had been a slow, deliberate act of poisoning. Olivia, his wife, had watched him fade away, all the while pretending to be the loving partner, the woman who was there to care for him. The suspicion was thin at first, but soon the whispers started. How could a man in his prime, seemingly healthy, deteriorate so quickly? And how could those closest to him not see the signs until it was too late? This wasn't just a case of illness. This was a calculated crime that had been unfolding for months without anyone realizing it. Thomas Jameson was a respected figure in the community, a businessman whose company was thriving. His wife, Olivia, was known for her grace, her devotion to her husband, and the perfect life they appeared to share. They lived in a grand home, attended social gatherings, and seemed like the embodiment of success and happiness. So when Thomas began showing signs of illness, no one suspected foul play. The community rallied around the couple, offering condolences and support. Olivia, calm and composed, seemed to be handling the situation with remarkable poise. But behind closed doors, something darker was at work. The signs of poisoning were subtle: an unexpected loss of appetite, weight loss, fatigue, but they didn't seem out of place at first. Perhaps the stress of his business, or the late nights in the office, could explain his gradual decline. Still, something felt off to those close to him, though no one dared to say it aloud. When the police first arrived on the scene, it seemed like a straightforward investigation. A middle-aged man found dead at home. An unfortunate incident, surely. But as the detective dug deeper, the inconsistencies became undeniable. There were no clear signs of an accident or injury, and the timeline of Thomas's deterioration was too methodical to be dismissed as coincidence. The medical examiner confirmed the worst. Traces of poison had been found in his system. But this wasn't a case of a one-time ingestion. This was a slow, meticulous poisoning. Doses that built up over time, carefully administered without raising suspicion. And it didn't take long for the investigation to circle back to Olivia. She was the one who had been closest to him in the final months of his life, the one who had spent every day by his side, the one who had claimed to be his caretaker. The mood surrounding the investigation was heavy, fraught with tension. There was a sense of disbelief, even among the police. How could someone so close to him, someone who appeared to love him, be capable of such a cold, calculated act? There was a mix of pity and suspicion as they examined Olivia's every word and gesture. Her grief seemed genuine, but how could they ignore the mounting evidence? The deeper the investigation went, the clearer it became. This wasn't an isolated incident. This was murder, a crime that had been carried out with such precision and care that no one had noticed until it was too late. The atmosphere was thick with uncertainty and anticipation. Everyone wanted answers, but would they like the truth when it finally came to light? The case had begun, but no one knew yet how far the rabbit hole would go, or how quickly the truth would catch up with the woman who thought she had gotten away with it all. The investigation was just beginning, and the answers, terrifying and unexpected. Thomas Jameson had always been the kind of man people admired from a distance. Tall, with broad shoulders that suggested both strength and discipline, he was a figure who commanded respect in both his personal and professional life. To his friends, he was the ideal businessman, a visionary with a sharp mind, a knack for negotiation, and a fierce dedication to his company. His success was no accident. Every detail of his life had been carefully crafted, from his spotless career to the picture-perfect home he shared with his wife Olivia. Yet beneath the polished exterior, there was another side to Thomas, a side only those closest to him knew about. He had grown up in a modest neighborhood, the son of a hard-working father and a nurturing mother. His early years were shaped by both struggle and ambition. Despite the financial difficulties his family faced, Thomas had always been driven. It wasn't just about making money. It was about proving something to himself, to his parents, and to the world. His family was the anchor in his life, but his career was the force that propelled him forward. As he moved through life, making connections and building his business, Thomas became a man of focus and purpose. He wasn't without flaws, though. His relentless pursuit of success sometimes left little room for personal connections beyond his immediate circle. This meant long hours at work, many missed family gatherings, and a sense of loneliness that crept in during quiet moments, though he rarely spoke about it. And then there was Olivia. To outsiders, she was the ideal wife, beautiful, composed, and endlessly supportive. Their marriage had seemed to the world like a love story made in heaven, but those closest to Thomas knew there were cracks hidden beneath a glossy surface. Olivia had always been the more emotional of the two, with an intensity that matched his cool demeanor. She had married Thomas in her early 20s, drawn to his ambition and success, and together they had built a life of luxury. But in private, their relationship was far more complicated. Olivia had struggled with feeling overshadowed by Thomas's accomplishments, her own desires often put on the back burner in favor of his career. She had loved him deeply, but as the years passed, a sense of resentment had quietly taken root. The tension between them was subtle, but it was there, lurking in the quiet moments, in the way she watched him from across the dinner table, or how she'd retreat into herself when he was too caught up in his work. While Thomas's life had been marked by ambition, Olivia's had have been marked by expectation. She wanted to be seen, to be heard. But as the years wore on, it became harder and harder to feel like anything more than an accessory to her husband's success. The more she tried to maintain the image of the perfect wife, the more she felt like she was losing herself. And so, in the shadows of her carefully crafted persona, resentment grew, a quiet bitterness that would eventually drive her to act in ways no one could have imagined. The investigation into Thomas's death brought in a few key figures who would soon find themselves entwined in the web of suspicion. Detective Emily Carter was assigned to the case, a seasoned investigator. Emily was known for her sharp mind and an unwavering commitment to uncovering the truth, no matter how uncomfortable it might be. She had seen her fair share of crimes, but there was something about this case that felt different. The pieces didn't fit, and she couldn't shake the feeling that everyone involved was hiding something. Emily had a quiet determination, a reluctance to jump to conclusions without evidence, and a deep sense of empathy that allowed her to connect with the families and victims she encountered. Her sharp instincts told her that this case was far from ordinary. There was more here than met the eye, and it would take more than just the fact that Olivia's sister, Sarah. Sarah had always been a quiet, reserved woman, the opposite of Olivia in many ways. Where Olivia was fiery and passionate, Sarah was calm and measured, though her own life was not without struggles. She had been close to her sister, though their relationship had become strained over the years. Sarah had always been protective of Olivia, even when it seemed like her sister was making choices that weren't entirely healthy. She had always brushed off her sister's subtle complaints about Thomas, insisting that the marriage was just going through a rough patch. But now, as the investigation progressed, Sarah couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that something wasn't right. She had been one of the few who had spent significant time in the house during Thomas's decline, and in hindsight, there were things she couldn't quite explain. The final key player in the case was Thomas's best friend, Robert Hale. Robert had been Thomas's closest confidant for years, the one person who knew everything about his business and personal life. But recently, their relationship had become strained. Robert had always been the life of the party, a man who enjoyed the finer things in life just as much as Thomas. But unlike Thomas, he was reckless in his pursuits. His friendship with Thomas had taken a turn after a disagreement over business practices, and though they had patched things up, the bond between them had weakened. Robert was someone with a strong personality, yet his motivations were often clouded by his own desires. Was he merely a bystander in this tragic tale, or did his complicated relationship with Thomas hold a key to unraveling the mystery of his death? As the investigation took shape, these individuals, Olivia, Sarah, Robert, and Detective Carter, each carried their own burdens, their own secrets. The connections between them were delicate, but all were intricately woven into the fabric of Thomas's life. And with each passing day, as the investigation delved deeper, their lives began to intersect in ways that no one could have anticipated. Each of them would be forced to confront their own truths that might prove to be the key to unraveling the mystery of Thomas's death. The house was eerily quiet when Detective Emily Carter arrived at the scene. The lights had long since been dimmed, casting long shadows across the polished wooden floors. A faint smell of stale perfume hung in the air, mingling with the scent of freshly cut flowers, remnants of a bouquet left by well-wishers only days before. The house itself seemed like a memorial, a place frozen in time, as though the family had stepped away and would return any moment, as if nothing had ever happened. But there was a heaviness in the air, a palpable sense of dread, as if the walls themselves had absorbed the sorrow that had recently been cast over them. Thomas Jameson's body had already been removed, but his presence lingered. The investigation was in its early stages, and the house was still being meticulously combed for evidence. Detective Carter's boots clicked sharply on the marble floor as she moved toward the dining room, where a team of forensic experts were sitting through the aftermath. The room, once a gathering space for family dinners and parties, now felt hollow. The once inviting atmosphere of a home was now suffused with an unsettling stillness. An open window let in the crisp evening air, but it did nothing to clear the oppressive tension that hung in the room. Emily took in every detail as she surveyed the space. The table was perfectly set, untouched from the night before. A glass of water sat half-drunk on the table where Thomas had been seated during his final meal. Next to it was a small, empty bottle of what appeared to be mineral water, but there was something about it that didn't sit right. The label was slightly smeared, as if it had been handled more than it should have been, perhaps wiped down to remove fingerprints. Her eyes moved slowly across the room, noting the subtle traces of dust that had accumulated on the edges of furniture, details that suggested no one had been in the room for a long while. Yet, despite the stillness, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that this was more than just a simple case of natural death. This was something far darker. The crime scene felt as if it were holding its breath, waiting to reveal its secrets. As the investigation unfolded, a few key clues began to surface, but none of them were straightforward. A medical examiner's report confirmed the cause of death: poisoning. Thomas had ingested a lethal amount of a rare toxin, but the discovery of this substance only raised more questions. It wasn't something that could be found easily, and it wasn't a substance that could be purchased without a trace. The poison had been carefully administered over a period of weeks, maybe even months. It had been done in such a way that it wouldn't raise suspicion, in small doses that gradually weakened him. The doctors had missed it at first, attributing his weight loss and fatigue to stress and overwork. But in hindsight, the signs were clear. He had been poisoned slowly, methodically, and someone had been close enough to him to administer it without detection. The water glass was examined more closely, revealing traces of the poison. It seemed too perfect, too precise, and it pointed straight to Olivia. She had been the one taking care of him in his final days, the one who had been by his side through the nights when he could barely keep his eyes open. At first, her grief appeared genuine. She was the perfect wife, the devoted partner, devastated by the sudden loss of her husband. But Detective Carter couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that something was wrong. Olivia had been so calm, too calm. It was as if she was playing a part, as if she had rehearsed her role in this tragic drama. But how could she have done it? How had she managed to poison him without anyone noticing? As the investigation deepened, it became clear that Olivia wasn't the only one who might have had a motive. Sarah, Olivia's sister, had been close to the family, spending a considerable amount of time at the house during the weeks leading up to Thomas's death. Her role in the household had been somewhat secondary, but she had witnessed the gradual deterioration of her brother-in-law's health. The question on Emily's mind was whether Sarah had known more than she let on, or whether she had seen something that might point to a different culprit. And then there was Robert Hale, Thomas's best friend. His relationship with Thomas had been strained for some time, but could there have been a deeper conflict between them, one that had remained hidden from everyone else? Robert was a charismatic man, always surrounded by people, always the life of the party. But beneath that surface, there were cracks. Had their friendship truly ended on good terms, or had there been something darker at play? The first round of interviews yielded little new information. Olivia remained steadfast in her grief, refusing to let the detective in on her true feelings. She spoke of the love she and Thomas shared, of their life together, and how she had been by his side when he grew sick. She shed tears as she spoke, but there was a certain detachment to her sorrow, as if it was something she had learned to perform rather than truly experience. But Emily couldn't quite play. Sarah, for her part, seemed equally uncertain. She spoke of her sister's devotion to Thomas, but there was something in her eyes, something that spoke of confusion and fear. Robert was no help either. He came across as aloof, a man still grieving the loss of his best friend, but there was a coldness to his demeanor that didn't sit right with Emily. Had he known something? Had he been involved in some way? Each of the individuals involved had a plausible explanation for their actions and reactions, but as the days passed and the investigation unfolded, the lines between truth and deception began to blur. Each new discovery, no matter how small, only served to raise more questions. What had truly happened in the last months of Thomas's life? Who was responsible for his slow and painful death? And why did it feel as though everyone involved was hiding something? Detective Carter's instincts told her that the answers were just out of reach, but she couldn't stop chasing them. The more she learned, the more she realized that this case was far from simple. There were layers of lies, of hidden motivations, and a tangled web of relationships that would take time to untangle. As the investigation stretched into its second week, the answers seemed to slip further out of reach. Detective Emily Carter had hoped for a breakthrough, but the case had grown more convoluted with each passing day. What had initially seemed like a straightforward poisoning case was becoming a tangled web of contradictions and confusion. There were no clear answers, only shadows, and the deeper Emily dug, the more she began to question everything. The guilt she had once thought was so obvious. Olivia, the devoted wife, was now shrouded in uncertainty. The clues that pointed to her were beginning to feel like convenient coincidences, and the nagging thought that perhaps the wrong person was under suspicion wouldn't leave her mind. The first major twist came when the forensic team uncovered something that had been overlooked earlier, a set of fingerprints on the bottle of mineral water that didn't belong to Olivia or Thomas. The prints belonged to Sarah. At first, Emily was stunned. Sarah had seemed like an innocent bystander, someone with no clear motive to harm her brother-in-law. But the discovery forced her to take a closer look at Sarah's involvement in the household during the final days of Thomas's life. Sarah had been in the house often, spending hours with her sister, helping Olivia care for Thomas when he grew too weak to do much on his own. The question now was whether Sarah had played an unknowingly pivotal role in her sister's actions, or if she had been complicit in the slow poisoning of her brother-in-law. As the investigators pieced together Sarah's movements, they began to uncover a series of inconsistencies in her story. When Emily and her team re-interviewed Sarah, they discovered that she had been more present in Thomas's life than she had let on. She admitted to being in the house late at night, sometimes staying for hours after Olivia had gone to bed. She'd insisted that she was only trying to help, but as the investigation deepened, Emily couldn't help but wonder if Sarah had known more than she was letting on. Had she noticed the changes in Thomas's health? Did she know that her sister was involved in something far darker than she had been willing to acknowledge? Her vague responses only seemed to deepen the mystery, and Emily was left with more questions than answers. Yet just when it seemed like Sarah might be the missing piece of the puzzle, another lead emerged, one that made Emily question her entire theory. Robert Hale, Thomas's best friend, had been acting strangely throughout the investigation. At first, his aloofness seemed like nothing more than the grief of losing a close friend. But as the case progressed, his demeanor. He had been evasive during his initial interview, and when when Emily had dug into his past, she uncovered a series of financial troubles that had been kept hidden from the public eye. Robert's business ventures had been faltering, and it appeared that he was in debt to some very dangerous people. Emily's instincts told her that this was the kind of man who might have something to gain from Thomas's death, especially if it meant inheriting a portion of his wealth. She soon learned that Robert had been in the house the night before Thomas died, but he had never mentioned it before. Had he known about the poisoning? Had he been involved? Or was he simply a man grasping at straws, trying to keep his head above water? The investigation had now taken an unexpected turn. Every theory, every piece of evidence, seemed to conflict with the next. The deeper they looked, the more layers there were to uncover. Each lead led to another, and the complexity of the case only grew. But it wasn't just the case that was growing more complicated. It was the emotional toll it was taking on those involved. Olivia was becoming increasingly isolated. The grief she had once worn as a shield was now slowly turning into something darker, more volatile. Her interactions with the investigators had become strained, and Emily could feel the wall that Olivia had put up. She had spent days mourning, but now it seemed she was starting to get defensive, her answers becoming clipped and guarded. Was she trying to hide her guilt, or was she simply overwhelmed by the pressure? Realizing that the investigation had begun to unravel everything she had carefully kept hidden, Emily could see it in her eyes. The faint flicker of fear, the brief moments when she seemed to struggle with keeping her composure. There was something more there, something lurking beneath the surface. But what? As the investigation deepened, the emotional strain on Olivia's family became evident. Sarah, once so certain of her sister's innocence, was now questioning everything. She had begun to doubt her sister's version of events, torn between loyalty and the mounting evidence that something wasn't right. The relationship between the two women, once unbreakable, was slowly crumbling under the weight of suspicion. Sarah had started to avoid her sister, spending more time at her own apartment rather than in the house where she had spent so many hours caring for Thomas. Was she distancing herself because she was overwhelmed by the investigation, or was she hiding something? The tension between the two sisters had reached a boiling point, and Emily could sense it. Meanwhile, Detective Carter was beginning to feel the weight of the investigation on her own shoulders. The leads were getting colder, the suspects more tangled in their own webs of lies, and the emotional pressure was starting to take its toll. Emily had never been one to let her emotions cloud her judgment, but the frustration of the case was slowly eating away at her. She found herself snapping at her colleagues, pushing them harder than necessary, and second-guessing herself at every turn. There were moments when doubt crept in, when she questioned whether she was missing something obvious, some crucial detail that had eluded her until now. It was easy to lose sight of the bigger picture when the stakes were this high, and Emily's frustration was palpable. Every clue felt like a false lead. Every suspect seemed to hold a piece of the truth, but no one was telling her the whole story. The investigation had reached a crossroads, and the deeper Emily went, the more she realized that the truth was not going to come easily. There were no clear answers, only more questions. But the emotional strain on those involved, the mounting pressure on the investigators, and the dark secrets that were slowly coming to light all pointed to one thing. Investigation, this had reached a fever pitch. Every lead, every clue, had been scrutinized until it felt like there was nothing left to uncover. But just when Detective Emily Carter thought she had reached the end of her rope, a breakthrough came. An unexpected discovery that would shift the course of the entire case. It was a piece of evidence that had been sitting in plain sight, overlooked by everyone involved. While reviewing Thomas's financial records once again, something caught Emily's eye. A series of unusual transactions that had been made in the weeks leading up to his death. Large sums of money had been transferred to an account under a false name, one that didn't match any known associate of Thomas's. The transfers had been made under the guise of investments, but the amounts were too large to be anything but suspicious. The account led to a shell company with ties to a business Robert Hale had been involved in. Emily's heart sank as the realization began to dawn on her. Robert had been deep in financial trouble, and he had a lot to gain from Thomas's death. The money he had been receiving was part of a scheme to frame Olivia for her husband's murder, using her as a pawn in a larger plan. This discovery changed everything. Emily immediately called for a meeting with her team. The financial records, paired with a few other pieces of evidence they had gathered, pointed to a disturbing theory. Robert, in his desperation, had orchestrated a slow poisoning of Thomas, knowing that Thomas's fortune would pass to Olivia upon his death. But Robert's plan hadn't been perfect. He had underestimated Olivia's potential as a suspect and her ability to evade the investigators' suspicions. In fact, it was Olivia who had uncovered the financial transactions first, before anyone else had noticed. The moment she realized her husband's death was no accident, she'd turn on her best friend. With this revelation in hand, Emily and her team moved quickly to confront Robert. Emily's heart raced as she prepared for what would be the most difficult moment of her career. It was time for the final confrontation, the moment where everything would come crashing down. They brought Robert into the interrogation room, his expression as cold and unreadable as ever. For a moment, there was a tense silence. Robert's eyes flickered with something, a hint of recognition, perhaps, but also something darker. Emily laid the evidence on the table, one piece at a time. She showed him the financial records, the shell company, the transfer of money, all of it pointing directly to him. Robert's facade faltered faltered only slightly, but his hands remained steady. Emily could see the gears turning in his mind as he calculated how to respond. He tried to play the part of a friend caught in an impossible situation. He denied any involvement, claiming that he had simply helped Thomas with some investments that had gone awry. But Emily was having none of it. She pressed him, demanding to know the truth. Slowly, piece by piece, the walls began to crumble. Robert admitted that he had been in serious financial debt, and when he realized that Thomas's death would leave Olivia in control of a large inheritance, he saw an opportunity. He had never intended for Thomas to die, at least not at first. But as time went on, he realized that Olivia's growing suspicions about his involvement in their finances would make it harder to hide his actions. So he had shifted his plan, making it look as though Olivia had poisoned her husband in an effort to gain the inheritance. Emily could sense that something was missing. There was no remorse in his voice, no sign that he felt the gravity of what he had done. He had played the long game, and now he was simply trying to avoid the consequences. But as he spoke, Emily couldn't help but notice something that hadn't sat right from the beginning. There was a twist, a final revelation that would change the entire narrative. Robert hadn't acted alone. The confession shook Emily to her core. It wasn't just Robert who had been orchestrating the plan. He had been working with someone else, someone much closer to home. The true mastermind behind the murder had been none other than Olivia herself. In the final moments of the confrontation, the truth came out in a stunning twist. Olivia had known about Robert's involvement from the very beginning. She had been playing the long game as well, feeding him the information he needed to carry out the slow poisoning. While Robert had thought he was manipulating Olivia, she had been using him all along. She had convinced him to frame her for the murder, knowing that it would be the perfect way to clear herself and secure her position as the sole beneficiary of Thomas's fortune. Olivia had calculated every step, every action, and she had done it so subtly that no one had suspected her. The emotional toll of this discovery hit Emily hard. She had spent days looking for the truth, only to realize that the person she had initially dismissed as a grieving widow had been the true mastermind all along. Olivia's cold and calculating demeanor had hidden behind a mask of grief, and her betrayal was all the more devastating because of how well she had played her role. The final confrontation, the final twist, was not just about solving the case. It was about coming to terms with the fact that the person closest to the victim had been the one who orchestrated the entire tragedy. As the case reached its resolution, the weight of the emotional impact settled over everyone involved. Emily had uncovered the truth, but it came with a cost. The family was torn apart, the lies had shattered everything, and the investigation had revealed the darkest of human motivations. Olivia's arrest brought a sense of closure, but the haunting question of how someone could betray the person they loved remained. The case was closed, but the wounds it left behind would never fully heal. The investigation had uncovered the complex, dark side of human nature, and while justice had been served, the scars would remain long after the final gavel fell. As the courtroom doors closed behind Olivia, the weight of the investigation lingered in the air. Detective Emily Carter stood in the hallway, watching as the woman who had once been a grieving widow now faced the consequences of her actions. The case that had consumed so much of her life was now over, but the impact of what had unfolded would remain forever etched in her memory. Olivia's conviction brought a sense of closure, but it was a hollow kind of closure. Emily had hoped that justice would bring some semblance of peace to the family, but instead, the fractured relationships and the deep scars left by the truth seemed impossible to mend. Sarah, once so close to her sister, had retreated into herself, unable to fully process the betrayal. The loss of her brother-in-law, the man she had known and loved as a member of the family, had been made all the more painful by the revelation of Olivia's involvement in his death. Sarah's grief was compounded by guilt. Guilt that she had not seen the signs earlier. Guilt that she had been so blind to the darkness hidden in her sister's heart. The weight of that knowledge crushed her, and the emotional toll was evident in every interaction she had with those around her. She had lost not only Thomas, but also her sister, Emily, the person she had trusted life most and would never be the same. And for Olivia, the path forward was equally grim. She had been sentenced to life in prison, but that didn't feel like a true punishment. The person who had once been a devoted wife, the woman who had shown nothing but love and care for her husband, had now been reduced to someone who had killed him with a cold and calculating precision. The betrayal, the manipulation, it all hung over her like a cloud, and there was no escaping it. The justice system had done its job, but the emotional devastation of what had transpired was impossible to undo. The community, too, was left to grapple with the aftermath. Thomas's death had shaken them, and Olivia's role in it had left them in disbelief. How could someone so close to the victim, someone trusted and loved by all, commit such an atrocious act? It wasn't just a tragedy for the family, it was a tragedy for everyone who had known them. The whispers in the small town had turned to murmurs of suspicion, and the once innocent image of the couple was forever tainted. Olivia's arrest had been a public spectacle, and as she was led away, there was a deep sense of sadness in the air, a sadness that could not be erased by the verdict. For Emily, the resolution of the case brought its own set of emotions. The satisfaction of solving the mystery was overshadowed by the heavy weight of what it meant. She had uncovered the truth, but the cost had been far greater than she had anticipated. The case had taken a toll on her as well, testing her resolve, challenging her beliefs in human nature, and leaving her with a lingering sadness that would follow her for years to come. There was a certain peace in knowing that the perpetrator had been brought to justice, but Emily knew that justice, in this case, was a double-edged sword. The truth had come to light, but in doing so, it had shattered everything. As she sat in her office, staring at the case file one last time, Emily couldn't help but reflect on what she had learned throughout this investigation. The slow erosion of trust between family members, the way the truth had been buried under layers of lies and manipulation. It was a reminder of just how fragile human relationships could be. The case had begun with a simple question: who killed Thomas? But as Emily had delved deeper, she had uncovered something much more complex, a web of deceit, betrayal, and ambition. It had been a journey she would never forget, one that had left its mark on her in ways she hadn't anticipated. And as the days went on, the haunting question lingered in Emily's mind: how much do we really know about the people closest to us? The ones we love, the ones we trust. How can we ever truly know what lies beneath the surface? This case had shown that even the most familiar faces could harbor secrets that, when uncovered, the investigation would destroy had been immense. The emotional devastation was not just limited to those directly involved. It reached out to the investigators, the community, and even Emily herself. In the end, justice had been served, but at what cost? The tragedy of Thomas's death, coupled with the betrayal of his wife, would never be fully erased. The scars of the case would linger, and as time passed, those who had been left behind would have to find a way to live with the knowledge of what had happened. In the final moments of the case, as Emily closed the file and walked out of her office, she felt a quiet emptiness. The truth had been revealed, but in some ways, that truth had only deepened the mystery. The investigation had begun as a search for answers, but it had ended with more questions. The answers didn't bring peace. They only brought a deeper understanding of the darkness that exists in the hearts of those we trust the most. As the narrator's voice fades, the audience is left with the echo of that question: how well do we really know those we love? How much can we trust the people closest to us before it's too late? And what happens when the truth finally comes to light, shattering everything we once believed? The haunting implications of the case linger long after the final scene fades to black, leaving the viewer to ponder the true nature of trust, love, and betrayal.